Welcome back to WCB Jazz Vinyl. Today I'm going to talk about a brand new release by Jerome Sabbagh on his own Analog Tone Factory label, and it is called Heart. So technically this is coming out on August 30th, but I actually placed a pre-order for it after seeing Jerome interviewed on the Jazz Bums YouTube channel, and guess what? The pre-orders have actually already shipped. So yeah, let's talk about this release, and specifically I want to address a couple of things. The label's all analog process, the music that's on here, the musicians, and of course, how does it sound? So now is a perfect time to remind you to click that subscribe button. And in case you can't find it, well, I've made it even easier for you. I added a button in the bottom, you're right, yeah, so bottom right-hand corner of the screen. You can also find me on Instagram, where I post about records pretty much every single day. If anyone out there wants to interact with a fairly large group of vinyl collectors and music appreciators on Instagram, I would encourage it. It's a lot of fun. Anyway, you can find me at what_can_brown. Okay, so Jerome Sabbagh is a saxophonist and composer born in France, but currently a resident of Brooklyn. He's been on the scene since the late 90s and played with everyone from Paul Motion to Kenny Barron, Reggie Workman, Andrew Surreal. His latest album, again, is called simply Heart, and this is what the album looks like. Features Sabbagh with Joe Martin on bass and Al Foster on drums. So Martin has been playing with Sabbagh for decades, I believe. Meanwhile, Al Foster probably needs no introduction to folks who follow me, but I am going to tell you anyway. So Foster started out, as far as I can tell, playing with Blue Mitchell. He played on The Thing to Do and Down With It, as well as Heads Up. Each of those were on Blue Note. Played with Miles Davis in the 1970s and 80s. He played on a favorite album of mine that came out in the 70s called, I think it was the 70s, that was by Mike Knock. It's called In, Out, and Around. Fantastic album. He also played with Joe Henderson, McCoy Tyner, Joanne Brackeen, Ron Carter, Art Pepper, Duke Jordan, Sonny Rollins, Tommy Flanagan, Cedar Walton. I can go on and on and on. So in any event, Al Foster's a legend. All the musicians here are fantastic, but Al Foster is certainly a legend. All right, so you heard me say something about Analog Tone Factory, and that may be an unknown label to you, and that would make sense. So let me tell you about it. So Analog Tone Factory is the label that put this out, and it is Jerome Sabbagh's own label. So the idea behind this is that they're going to be releasing all analog vinyl, as well as reel-to-reel and CDs, I believe, at least according to the website. And at the moment, if you go to that website, they actually have 3 releases of Sabbah's own music. But Heart is technically, so this album is technically the first one for the Analog Tone Factory, sort of label, or the first one under that banner. People who are interested in equipment and more knowledgeable than me, which is probably many of you, should probably head over to analogtonefactory.com, and you can actually go and get the gear rundown. The mission, however, with this label, as far as I understand, is to get as close to the sound of the recordings of the 50s and 60s as possible, which was a time, and I had to look this up on the website because I don't know these things, but that was a time when the Ampex 351 was the all-tube tape machine in use. So guess what? This is the exact item that this new label, Sabbah's label, uses, but they've done some level of customization to it where it's capable of recording at 30 inches per second, or IPS. This particular album was recorded live to 2-track tape directly to that Ampex tape machine by James Farber. It was mastered then and cut by Bernie Grunman directly from the analog tape using an all-tube system. There is no EQ, no mixing, no dubs, no edits here. And no, of course, means nothing if it doesn't also mean that the music sounds good. And guess what? It does indeed sound really great. And that's what we're going to get into. So I mention that because audiophile for audiophile's sake is not like enough for me anyway. Like, the music also has to be good, and maybe that goes without saying, but I do think, but there's a lot of people that sort of fawn over the sound and the detail, right? Sonic detail of pressings, and sometimes I do that even, even on this channel, I talk about that, but it is at the end of the day, you also have to have music that you want to hear. So to kind of recap, though, where we are, we have musicians with some serious credentials. We have an all-analog, unbroken chain, if you will. We have Bernie Grundman and James Farber involved. And again, the intent with the labels to get at that classic vintage sound, right? Incidentally, this is also on 180-gram vinyl. So the music here. What we have on this album are 8 tracks, and they do include a mix of originals as well as compositions from, probably well-known artists to you. So those include Prelude to a Kiss, which is a Duke Ellington composition. You also have ESP, which is by Wayne Shorter. There's a Benny Carter tune here. So there are some familiar tracks, but there's also some originals. I was going to say baggage. Baggage isn't the right word, but I guess the expectation that comes with an album like this, and when I say like this, I mean a piano-less trio, is that it's going to perhaps be in the style of Sonny Rollins. He and, to be fair, others were pioneers of this idea of like kicking the piano out of the group and not being burdened by, sort of these prescribed chord progressions that would be played with, again, chords by the pianist. I don't think, after listening to this album, I don't think that Sabbagh at all is trying to mimic Rollins' style here by any means. Although I do think it would be unfair to suggest that Sabbagh wasn't influenced by Rollins. And so, I think tangibly he's not mimicking Rollins. He's not playing with the same level of, I don't know, intensity or ferociousness. And in fact, I think if anything, the overall mood of this album is one more of subtlety. So again, certainly think of Rollins in terms of thinking of the sparseness of a piano-less trio that's led by a saxophonist, but also understand that I think that this is very much Jerome Sabbagh's his own album. So the format of this trio, speaking of, is, let's see, drums in the right, bass in the middle, and Sabbagh in the left. Yeah, I think I got that right. I did notice that there was a decent amount of bleed of the drums into the left channel, from the right into the left. But the tangible impact here is that you actually get a really good sense of the positioning of the instruments in the room. You also get some of the room sound, and you don't have that hard pan effect where all you hear out of the right is drums and all you hear out of the left is sax. Instead, having a little bit of that bleed gives it a much more natural sound, I think, and I think it sounds really great. I just alluded to this, but I think the best way to describe this album is nuanced. So that opener that I referenced, which was the Ellington tune, Prelude to a Kiss, features Sabbagh playing this sort of, sentimental melody, and he does so in a little bit of kind of like free time, or without prescribed time signature, it would seem, at least up front. So he does this against kind of a minimalist bass and some subtle accents from the drums, and pay attention to those accents because there's like a lot of interest there, I think. There may be an implied rhythm, I think, as the piece continues, like after that initial opening where it's almost like a coda, where Sabbah's kind of like, again, playing this kind of like, free of time kind of interpretation of the melody. But to the extent that there is a rhythm even later on, it may be more of like a pulse rather than, say, counting out the beats of the measure. All right, so ESP follows, and what I really like about this track is the interaction between the musicians. And maybe that's what I love about the first track too, but I think it's different on this one. So the first one, it was, fairly minimalist, whereas here you have each musician actually quite busy, and they complement each other really, really well. There may be, like, for example, there may be a moment where Sabbagh plays something with like a honk or a shriek or like a subtle atonal kind of lick, and Joe Martin responds on bass with either like going up an octave or playing a more rapid line to kind of pair with it. And I think that, again, I think what's really great about this particular track is that interaction and paying attention to almost, it's not really call and response, but I know in some ways it is a little bit of a call and response with how these musicians kind of interact with each other. And it's, what's really nice is to be able to have a couple of these more familiar tunes, because I think when you've kind of internalized the melody, because you've heard these tracks before, it allows you to be open to maybe some of the other subtleties or some of the other things that the musicians are doing with the pieces. So track 3 is actually titled Hearts. So that's the title track, and it's an original piece by Sabbagh. presumably debuting here. I'm not positive on that. But what I will say is that it has a very familiar feel that I can't really put my finger on why, but I think it's a very pleasing kind of melody. It sounds really good. I also think it's one of the strongest tracks on this entire album. So I really like Al Foster on brushes here, and I think it helps. I think the softness of those brushes helps elevate the Martin's bass in the mix, and I think it also helps establish more sort of space around Sabbagh's horn as well. Incidentally, I noticed a moment where Foster almost like lets out a sigh. This isn't the only part of the place in this album where you hear a little bit of that, but being able to make out some of these subtle details in the recording, I think, is really fun. Here, I would say on this track, it feels like Martin's bass is the glue, whereas both Sabbagh and Foster are sort of exploring a little bit more. And it's nice to be able to hear that both out of left and right channel. I think it just adds a little bit more sort of ambiance. So again, Martin is more of the heartbeat with his bass, and I would say that sometimes he sort of switches between being, grounding the piece in terms of chords, but also grounding it in terms of taking on some of the rhythmic duties as well. Foster at some point here switches from brushes to what sounds to me like a closed hi-hat. So that's the cymbals that go like this. I don't know if I have to explain some of these things, so forgive me. But it's when he switches to that, it's so delicate and so subtle and yet so present and detailed. And I just think it's a really great example of the ability of the engineer and the recording process to be able to take all of this just fantastic energy and music that's being played and making sure that it's presented in such a nice way. All right, so just a couple of more points. I'm not going down every track, but a couple of more, because I think that there's a lot of interesting things going on in this album. So while I would not call this album avant-garde by any means, like at least as a sort of a cohesive album, and it isn't free jazz either across the board, I would say that some tracks have a little bit more of an explorative sort of free vibe than others. So great example, the first track on side 2, it's titled Right the First Time. And it's definitely the free-est here. Now, what I would say about this is that it isn't so out there, and maybe it's free in the same way that like kind of almost has like a little bit of a Marion Brown kind of vibe to it in terms of how he plays free music. So maybe more concretely, it does have an organic nature to it. It feels grounded, and that the musicians are feeding off each other in a way that you can, as a listener, follow and appreciate, even if you're someone who otherwise doesn't listen to much free jazz. Guess what? That's me. So then, of course, after you have something that is a little bit more explorative like that, it's followed by the Benny Carter original that's taken at a slow but like swinging pace, and it's a really nice setting, I think, for Sabbagh to play in perhaps an older style, but again, without copying anyone in particular. So I think that I actually personally think that the slower pace on this piece is where you get an even closer listen to exactly how Sabbagh phrases his, does his phrasing with the saxophone, and how he attacks and shapes notes as well. So if anything, even despite the fact that it's basically a standard, it's almost more of a Sabbagh highlight, if you will. So anyway, I think that's all I'll say in terms of the individual tracks. But again, there are more. There's 8 total tracks, and there's certainly more great stuff here. I think that what I'd like to do though is maybe close it out. So, in summary, I think that this is a fabulous album just on its own in terms of the music here. And so in that way, I think if you're a high-res person, if you're a CD person, or if you're a vinyl person, I think you're still going to be able to get something great out of this music just on its own. And really, that probably goes without saying. I mean, honestly, the recording processes and how it's transferred to these different mediums, I think each medium has merits. Obviously, I'm a vinyl person, right? So in my opinion, the album, though, as great as the music is, it's sort of amplified, if you will, by the recording process and how outstanding that it sounds. Again, that like the sonics of it, the detail, all of that. I'm also going to cautiously suggest that this album exceeds what we've seen thus far from Kevin Gray's new label, Coherent Records, in terms of, again, the recording and sort of presentation aspect. And of course, this isn't a competition. And when I say that, I mean to use that statement more to complement this album than tear down the work that Gray has done with the musicians that he's been working with. I actually think that it's great that we have both labels now putting out music seemingly with similar ambitions. So for those interested in this album, you can indeed hear this before you buy it. Which I think is important, not to sort of fall victim to the to the hype. Go and listen to it. So I did a little bit of research. You can find tracks on Apple Music and on Bandcamp as well. There's a few tracks on Bandcamp, I believe. Tracks have been uploaded to YouTube. If you want the vinyl, as far as I can tell at the moment, even though some of Sabbagh's previous albums are available on Acoustic Sound's website, for this one, I think you do have to go to analogtonefactory.com. And know that if you do decide to buy the vinyl, they include a digital download card for the high-res files at 192/24 as well. So that's pretty cool for those of you who are into that. There's a standard edition of this album. And actually here, I'm sorry, things are falling out. Here's the download card that comes with it. So there's a standard black vinyl. I mean, all these are black vinyl, I think, but there's a standard edition that's available. There's also one that's it's like numbered and limited to 500 copies. So mine, because I did the pre-order, mine's of the the numbered copy, have number 262. There's also a signed edition. In any event, if you're buying vinyl, they start at $40 mark. So it's actually a price point that's similar to Tone Poet and other what I'll call sort of audiophile grade albums. Apparently also, if you live in Paris, you can pick up your album in person. Don't ask me for details on that. I just saw that on their website. So with that, I will simply show you this album again. This is the front, very vibrant colors on this album, and I think it looks really nice. This is the back. It's a big recommend for me. I got to be honest, this is a little bit of a blind buy. I said that I saw an interview with Sabbagh, and that's kind of what brought me to him. I don't know that I had necessarily heard his work before, but I'm really happy to have discovered it now, and I think that this is another one of those labels, like Coherent, like JMI, Analog Tone Factory. I think is one of those labels that we have to pay attention to, because they're sort of doing great work, and I think it's amazing that there's labels out there that are willing to put that added, energy and money, of course, and attention to detail into presenting new music. I think it's really exciting. So hopefully I told you something that you didn't know, or made you aware of this album that maybe you weren't aware of it before. Big recommend for me. That's it for today. I'll see you next time.